Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nancy Hopko, Chair of the Health Committee of the League of Women Voters, Delaware County. On behalf of the League, I thank you for joining us today for what we hope is a first in a series of programs about gun safety and gun control this year. Many of us are academics, so we run on an academic year. As many of you know, prior to the pandemic, our Hot Topics programs were luncheons with guest speakers, but due to the pandemic, most programs have been Zoom presentations. We have been amazed and delighted at the very positive response to having these programs as Zoom meetings. As of earlier this morning, 50 people registered for this program, and we know that our outreach expands geometrically through access to recorded programs on our website. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization committed to promoting political responsibility through informed and active participation in government, citizenship, and elections. Our motto is making democracy work, and we do that through registering people to vote, organizing and presenting candidate forums, providing candidate information through vote411.org, and hosting educational programs on various issues of concern. Today's Hot Topic program is called Life or Death, Standing Up to Gun Violence in Pennsylvania. Someone is killed with a gun every 6 hours in Pennsylvania. Since 2002, CeaseFire PA has become a trusted voice, definitive resource, and galvanizing force for member organizations, the general public, members of the media, and policymakers. CeaseFire PA uses its network and platform to ensure that those impacted by gun violence are heard by those with the power to effect the most change. Our speaker, Adam Garber, is Executive Director, CeaseFire PA. Adam will provide an overview of the problem of gun violence, strategies for prevention, and ongoing advocacy efforts, including citizen engagement. Adam has a long history of advocacy through his work at the U.S. Public Interest Group, where his investigations of contamination threats in food, cars, toys, and other consumer products received national coverage on CBS, the New York Times, and elsewhere, and as a clean air and water advocate in Pennsylvania. Before we start, there's a few housekeeping details for this Zoom meeting. All of the participants except Adam, me, and our tech wizard, Kathy, should be muted. The questions submitted prior to today have been shared with Adam, but additional questions can be submitted during the presentation using the chat function. Thank you for joining us all today for a very enlightening program, and be aware that we have a few upcoming events that you want to be aware of. November 14th at 12:30, our International Relations Study Group will be discussing war crimes using the Great Decisions curriculum of the Foreign Policy Association. That group will have a review of the 2023 program at their December 12th meeting. And on January 6th at 11:30, Gathering 2024, celebrating our League of Women Voters, will take place with a luncheon at the Springhaven Country Club. Details can be found on our website along with the recording of this program. If you Google LWV-CDC, League of Women Voters, Central Delaware County, you will find us. And now on to our program. Adam, thank you.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm always excited to talk to folks from the League of Women Voters. Y'all have been a longtime ally of ours, and I will say a longtime ally of mine in the many issues I've taken on over my career. And we really are at a critical moment on a lot of issues, but especially around gun violence. And so I want to first just give a little bit of grounding in where we are in the gun violence problem and a little bit beyond the numbers. And then two, talk about what are the policies that will help save many of the lives and where they are currently in the legislature, because we've made really pretty significant progress over the last 9 months compared to history in advancing some of the key solutions we need as a Commonwealth. And then I'll open it up to questions and discussion. So, I mean, I think everyone probably kind of knows the top line story around gun violence overall, whether it's the nightly news that reminds us of what's happening in Philadelphia. I'm sitting here in Point Breeze in South Philadelphia where I live. Or the horrific alerts and stories from after Lewiston. We've all kind of seen the toll of this crisis. I want to pull out two pieces on it. One, so just overall in Pennsylvania, we lost 1,948 people last year to gun violence. And when you dig into those stories, it really looks varied based on where you live. So while most people consider the majority of gun violence to be homicides and shootings and mass shootings, it's hard to ignore the fact that suicide, especially in our rural communities, is a significant portion of the problem. About half of all gun deaths, a little more in Pennsylvania, are suicide related. And are deeply impacting rural communities with the highest gun death rates happening in Wayne and up in the Poconos and Pike County, as well as down in the Southwest and like places like Bedford. And it's growing among youth in urban areas as a sense of hopelessness, I think, has set in. And so we've seen rising suicide rates in our in our more urban centers. And then we all know exactly the toll of the gun violence in a place like Philadelphia. You just have to watch the news. But I was talking to some supporters yesterday, and one of the things that really surprised them is that we missed the piece of the people who survived the shooting. We often hear the stories of the homicides and the deaths, and about 3,000 to 3,500 people survive a shooting, but are left with the lifelong toll. Sometimes it eventually gets to them. I was talking to a friend whose cousin was shot and paralyzed from the shooting and died many years later the other day. But the reality is they're living with that emotional and mental trauma. And as we've gotten better and better at preventing fatalities from shootings, it's actually that the fatality rate's gone down. So if we went back and we took a fatality rate from 20 years ago, we'd probably be losing more like 2,500 Pennsylvanians every year. And that's because we're really good at stopping the bleeding, which is really critical. A lot of people lose from blood loss. And we're really good at getting people quickly to the hospitals. And sadly, the surgeons have had way too much practice in the ERs preventing this violence. When I look at a shooting, we hear the stories, we hear the trauma, we hear the experiences. What I'm really listening for is, well, where did we fail to prevent it? Because there's a chain of events that led up to that moment in every case, both on a personal level and on an access to the gun level, that ultimately allow that violence to occur. And I'll give a few examples that we know really well right now. There's a woman, Jeannie Garcia, who lives up in Allentown. Jeannie lost her son, Kareem, about a decade ago. He was murdered in his bed in the midst of a gang war. And when they finally figured out where the gun came from, it came from a couple that lived in the Allentown suburbs and they originally purchased it. And the couple was known to the police. They had visited that house a few times. Because over the previous years, that couple had 40 of their guns show up at crime scenes. And you're like, well, why does this continue? Well, the couple just said we lost the firearm. And there's no legal requirement that you report your gun missing, lost, or stolen. And so the police had never taken action. When Jeannie's son, Kareem, was murdered, she traced down all this, realized that the couple was using it to traffic weapons into the city and make money, and eventually was able to get them charged with trafficking. But if there had been a reporting law in place beforehand, they would have gotten caught earlier and Kareem might still be alive. I was talking to Angela Hunt, whose son, Trooper Rougeau, Jay, was murdered. If folks remember, in June, there was a horrific attack on a police barracks in Juniata County. One trooper was injured and one was murdered. Trooper Rougeau lost his life, Jay Rougeau. And the gun that was used was an AR-15 style weapon. But what I think most people don't know, and we've been informed by the district attorney, is that that gun was bought through a private sale where you don't have to get a background check, and that individual couldn't legally get a gun any other way, that he wasn't legally allowed to own guns. He had a record, but because there was no process in place to stop that sale, the gun sale went through. Trooper Rougeau lost his life. Angela is understandably a disaster. I think I'll see her on Monday in Harrisburg, but she can't even imagine speaking to this day. I think, is still deeply angry and upset, understandably. And so for me, each of the gaps that we look at in us, each of these injuries, each of these lives lost, I think when we look at them, we go, well, what was the thing that allowed it to happen? And where did it fall apart? So what we've been focused on for the last few years at CeaseFire PA is building a common agenda to end gun violence, recognizing that no matter where you lose someone to gun violence, whether you're in the city or you're in a rural community, you are losing a loved one, and that through that common grief and that common pain and suffering, that there should be common bonds for solutions. And that if you need me to back you up on red flag or extreme risk protection orders, I need you to back me up on lost and stolen reporting, because the solutions are not going to be same for every community. And so we've got 130 partners at the table now. And that movement was able to move forward a few key policies, and there's more on the way. There's actually a hearing next week. So we're focused on 4 solutions right now. There's a lot more that we need, but you can't do it all at once to really move gun safety policies forward. The first is lost and stolen reporting. Just simply says you have to report a missing firearm within 72 hours to the law enforcement once you notice it's gone. And it's really intended as a mechanism to deal with traffickers who are using it as a loophole around our straw purchasing laws. In states that have this law, they've seen gun trafficking drop 48%. So that's a pretty significant drop in gun trafficking, and seems pretty common sense. The second is universal background checks. So in Trooper Rougeau's case, like I said, it is as my deputy director said the other week at a testimony, it is an instructional manual and a billboard for criminals on how to get a gun. When everyone knows that if I go and buy a gun, a long gun, I should say, so like an AR-15 or a rifle or a shotgun from my, from Nancy, then I don't have to get a background check. And that just gives me a space to go if I know I can't get one another way. The third is extreme risk protection orders, or red flag laws, as they're sometimes known. And this has been in the news a lot more since the Maine shooting. And we might come back to, there might be some questions. What about this yellow flag law versus this red flag law? So I'll just talk a little bit about the bill, and then we'll come back to why the differences are important. This bill passed with bipartisan support. I should say the universal background check bill and this bill passed with bipartisan support out of the House in May. This bill says that if you know someone who's in crisis where they are making threats or either to hurt themselves or to hurt others, you can ask the court to weigh the evidence and decide that they should not, for a period of time, have access to firearms. I want to be clear that it's not a mental health condition, because mental health is not particularly good predictor of violence. But for instance, I always say, if my wife came home today and said, I'm going to divorce you, Adam, and don't worry, that's not going to happen, I think. But, I would be at a higher risk for suicide, right? In that moment, I'm in crisis, and I would be at a higher risk. And someone should really think about whether, I don't have any guns, but if I did, so there's a lot of ifs in this statement, whether I should have access to guns, right? If I get fired from my job, all those situations. And it's not just enough for that, but there's other indicators: access to firearms, recent purchases, threats, and verbal commitments, right? All those pieces a judge can evaluate and decide you should lose access for a year, and then you get it back. Basically, let's let the crisis pass. Let's get you the help you need before others are injured. And then when the crisis and the issue is over, we'll give you access to your firearms back. That also passed on bipartisan support. The fourth and final one is safe storage, and it's actually going to run and we're focused on a particular version that's going to run next week in the Judiciary Committee. Safe storage says, in this case, we're working on a version that says if you have guns and you have a minor in your house, or on the premises, you have to secure them. So in my case, I have a 5-year-old daughter. She lives with me. If I own firearms, I'd have to secure them, and I can be held liable if I don't. That's it. And that bill will run in committee next week and then come out of the floor. This is really big progress in Pennsylvania because really in the last decade, the only bill we've passed on gun violence prevention is a bill a few years ago around domestic violence restraining orders to tighten up the process that if you have a domestic violence restraining order, you have to give up your firearm sooner until law enforcement. And that was really important. But 3 of the 4 of these really established new mechanisms and policies to keep communities safe and keep people in Pennsylvania safe. And they were able to get out of support because what we've known is true for a long time was proven, which is we know that most Pennsylvanians support these initiatives, and we know that there are legislators who support these initiatives, but have never had to vote on them before. And what changed was that the House decided in May to put these up for a full vote. And we watched 2 Republicans on one of them and 9 Republicans on another flip to voting yes. And so they became bipartisan. And before that, they could kind of talk outside of both their mouths because there was no vote. They didn't have to confront the issue. That was really momentous. And we're planning to move some others like the safe storage out. Unfortunately, lost and failed on a party line vote, and we can talk. And I'll give y'all a little preview. On Monday, we are launching an accountability campaign highlighting the Senate's refusal to even hold a hearing. So we're at about 6 months now. There's been no hearing. There's no planned hearing. In fact, we've been told by the chairwoman and by the majority leader that they will not hold a hearing on these bills. They won't even discuss them. And so we are putting a clock in the Capitol with the sign that lays out how long, how many days, minutes, and hours that's been since those bills have been sitting in committee, and highlighting the toll of that crisis and calling for action. And calling for them to just listen and hold a hearing and listen to experts and survivors and then ultimately drive it forward. So that's the next stage. And I would say it's going to be a challenging road because we don't have gun safety leaders in charge of the Senate. I know League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We are nonpartisan, even though we actually do endorse candidates. But, we've endorsed Republicans as well. We're here for the substance of gun safety, right? And unfortunately, we just know that while there are some Republicans who've privately told us they will support universal background checks, until the Senate leadership decides to run those bills, we will have a problem. And so our plan is to really, over the next 3 to 5 months, lay the consequences of their failure to act at their feet, highlighting the consequences of lost lives and what are the gaps in the safety system that could have been solved by these bills, what's the ongoing toll, and get voices like the League of Women Voters, like their constituents and others speak up. I'll just note one other thing, and then I'll open it up probably to questions and discussion. When we talk about crime and violence in Philly, y'all out in Delaware County have some legislators who like to talk about Philadelphia a lot and not exactly know what they're talking about. And I'm particularly thinking about Representative Craig Williams, who is parts of Delaware and Chester County. Representative Williams has again and again said, all this crime, et cetera, it's just Krasner's fault. And I'm not going to get into Krasner discussion. The bill that would do the most to reduce gun violence in Philadelphia is the Lost and Stolen Reporting Bill, and Representative Williams voted against it along with every other single Republican. And I think it's really important to know because they're they're making a case that they're about crime and safety and all. But as my representative said on the floor that day, if you want to do what Philadelphians want and what the Philadelphia police asked for, you'd pass lost and stolen reporting. Because if we can stop the flow of guns into Philadelphia, we will have a lot better success in preventing violence, or that violence will be a mugging, a stabbing, a punch to the face. It will be broken noses, bloodied, bad, but it will not be deadly most of the time. And so we've really got to get legislators to understand that when we're talking about gun violence, we need to deal with mass shootings. They're terrifying. Dropping my kid off is hard. We need to deal with suicide. things like extreme risk protection orders to give family members tools to prevent it. And we need to deal with the city of Philadelphia and other cities that are facing this enormous rise of violence, because right now we're getting a handle on it in Philadelphia. The investments in community-based programs has worked some. Homicides are actually down 30% in the city of Philadelphia, which is really big. But we're not going to get to where we need to be if we don't deal with the flow of firearms into the communities, and we don't have policies in place to really handle that today. So that's the quick story. I prefer to leave it for a conversation and discussion and all. So I'll just open it up here for people to ask questions. I know I got a ton ahead of time, lots of really good ones, but I'll let Nancy moderate this however we should.
Okay. We have the questions that were submitted in advance, and I invite people to submit in the chat box as we go, and I'll keep an eye on that. But for starters, please tell us about your Keep Kids Safe at School campaign and any tips that you have for league members or other community members about how to help our local schools.
That's a good question. So Keep Kids Safe campaign was really actually focused around the safe storage policy, because it was really around two things on a policy level, though I have some other suggestions. It was really focused on highlighting the need that if you're thinking about violence at schools, you need to think about safe storage. So 80% of guns used on school shootings, and I'm not just talking about your mass shootings, I'm talking about a shooting within a block of the campus, come from family members or friends. So most of those guns are getting access through unsecured firearms. And so we just know locking them up will go a really long way to preventing the kid to get access. We also know that arming guards, excuse me, I have hiccups all the time, in every school will not work. And there's a bill from Senator Regan that would require every school in the Commonwealth to have armed guards. Excuse me one second. See if that helps. Otherwise, we can all explore different hiccup tricks as a group. Everyone's got one. The ideal of arming guards I get is very instinctual. I just mean that as a parent, I want my kid to be safe. And in a world where the legislature won't do the thing that they should do, I'm what else can I do? And so this bill would require every school to put an armed guard. I think it was a $1 billion proposal. And what we know is not only is that demoralizing to our students and impacts their academics, but it does very little to prevent the violence. Many school shooters want to die. They intend to die in the shooting, so they actually go towards places where there are armed guards. Wow. And two is that mostly armed guards can only respond to after violence has begun. So at that point, usually people are injured or dead, rather than dealing with, well, how do we prevent it from happening in the first place? In terms of the Delaware County schools, it's a really good question. It's worth noting Delaware County has limited capacity just legally to enact its own laws, but there is some educational stuff that this county could do. Probably the biggest thing you could do is work to get your school districts to give out to parents educational materials about the importance of safe storage. There's a bunch of programs that do this. There's ones at CHOP has a program. Moms Demand Action has a program, and others. And basically what you do is you require every parent in the school to get a packet about the importance of safe storage and a gun lock, if they want one. And just that access question, while it seems small, is really important. And there are probably other things you could carefully do to have conversations. We talk with a lot of doctors about how to have conversations with patients carefully. And I can send along some language, but you want to do it in a non-judgmental way. I would say as parents, of kids, for me, I ask if when Ilani goes for a play date, I ask if they have firearms in the home. If they are, I ask if they're secure. Hopefully they are. If they're not, I'll get them a gun lock. And Ilani won't go about everything else for me. It's a conversation about, do you have dogs? dogs. You should probably know that. And you know, and you know, so hopefully that helps, Nancy.
Okay, thank you. I have a live question here. Somebody asks, why won't Craig Williams support legislation on lost and stolen?
Do you okay, so I will I mean, I think I will give you the political answer and the policy answer. The political answer, I think, is fundamentally that many of the legislators are more nervous about winning in the losing in the primary than they are in the general, and so they are unwilling to support policies where we will have them privately tell us, I agree on the substance, or I have no questions about the substance, but I just can't do it.
Okay.
And I think Craig probably falls into that camp for a few reasons, including that he's running for attorney general. He would never say it that way to me, but I think that's probably true. And some legislators have basically said that to us. The critique of lost and stolen reporting that we heard during the floor debate, so you understand what the policy side is from the other side, is that well, what if I don't know my gun was gone? So the example that always came up was, what if my 90-year-old grandfather didn't know his firearm was gone, and then the police came and arrested him? That's just not how the bill works functionally. So the bill requires you to know the gun was gone and make a conscious decision to not report it missing. And that's weaker than I think it should be in some ways personally, because I think everyone should know where their gun is, but like, you know where your car is for sure. I mean, I've lost my car like 3 times in my life, but you know, found it the same day, forgot where I parked it. But I think that like, that is the thing that they are supposedly afraid of. And we keep trying to articulate to them, that's just not how the policy works. And if you see an example like that, we're happy to have a solution around the policy side, but then they don't really have an example. And in addition, it's a fine. It's a very low level fine. It's not a misdemeanor. It's not a crime until you do it multiple times. So we're, again, really trying to go after these repeat offenders that are intentionally deciding to ignore this, or who are, you know, trafficking firearms. And that's really the intent behind it.
That's important. Thank you.
And for y'all in sorry, Nancy, just for Delaware County, like, we need Williams and we need other legislators to understand that they're at odds with their constituents. Because until they get that outside of an electoral framework where they're just getting overwhelming, like we heard from Republicans who voted with us, including Williams on the background check bill, I should say, I was just getting inundated with calls from my constituents.
Okay, thank you. I had another question asking about some of your partners, your 130 partners, and were any surprising to you? And I'm going to tag on to that question. Are there groups of hunters and marksmen who support safe gun laws?
That's a good question. I don't think we have any current hunting organizations that are part of the coalition. We have a few veteran groups, like Rise, Rank and File out in Pittsburgh, and the Veterans Leadership Council, and others. And we have a few, definitely a few partners there. And we have individual hunters, but we don't have any hunter organizations yet. We have a new staff member up in the Poconos who's doing a long-term work on rural suicide. And I know she's trying to connect with hunting organizations, but I'll say, like, one of my staff is a hunter, so she'll be out. She's a very good shot, so she'll get a nice buck in hunting season in a few weeks. And we have like hunters among our volunteers. In fact, one of them is speaking at a press conference on Monday with me. And so, you know, that's, yeah.
Good, thank you. Here's a question. Many staunch supporters of gun rights are not swayed in their position when they hear the statistics on gun violence. does a firsthand experience with gun violence change people's stance on gun safety legislation?
When you say firsthand, like when they are like shot, injured, accosted, etc.
Friend, family experience.
I don't know if we have any really good data on this. I would say the following things. So 20% of Americans know someone who was shot and injured or killed with a firearm. So already a fifth of Americans have that. And often we find even rural community members know someone who was lost. There's two issues. I mean, one is like where we need to build political power to move policy doesn't always align with where the most of the gun violence happens, unless you're, and if you're talking about rural suicide, it doesn't get talked about as much. I think sometimes it changes people and sometimes it doesn't. And I think that's because either a few things happen. One is for people that don't change, I think one is some of them go, well, now I need a gun to stay safe. And there's a very visceral, instinctual belief around that, even though the evidence is completely to the contrary. Two is in the case of suicide, they really think it's like just that person, that it is they don't really understand it can never happen to me, that it was a choice that person made, and they don't really understand how the firearm piece fits into it. One of the things that I think we need to do a better job of is articulating both the way violence happens in terms of crisis, and two, that it's really gaps in the safety system, that there's a long chain of events that occur leading up to that death that we can interrupt. And how do we interrupt that chain is really important. But so my general answer is I'm not aware. Like, I know plenty of survivors who are more active on this issue, but in terms of like just generally changing someone's mind because they know someone, I haven't seen that as much. Right? I'm not aware of any research on it, and
Okay, thank you. I have a live question. What is your opinion of and hope office for gun violence headed up by Vice President Kamala Harris?
I think that, I was down at the White House for the announcement. It was great. It's something we've asked for. I think a few things are hopeful about it. So one is just centrally to say we had nowhere in the administration that was centrally thinking about gun violence prevention all the time. Unlike other issues like environmental policy, where you have like the EPA, gun violence prevention is really mostly seen as a law enforcement activity, mixed up in the Justice Department, the FBI, ATF, etc. And so having a central place that is looking at all the different ways that the federal government can interrupt and prevent violence will be really important and drive it forward. Two is that in states that have stronger gun safety laws, which we don't particularly have, I think they will be really helpful in figuring out how to implement them well. So one of the things we know is like, it's good to have a good law. It's better to have an implemented law. And so in Pennsylvania, the domestic violence restraining order law that passed, while it took a step forward in getting guns out of the hands of abusers, we've seen relinquishment rates between 60% in Philly to like 80, 90% in the suburbs of Philly. If it was 100% or 99%, right, 98%, we would probably see a lot less violence and a lot less threats with guns. And so how do we improve that implementation is, I think, something the office is going to undertake. And then they're talking about ways to support states like Pennsylvania that really need more laws, or Maines of the world. But I don't know if that's kind of totally come together. It's on my list to figure out with them. But I think they're right now kind of focused on how do we coordinate across the administration and all.
Okay, thank you. Another live question. What does CeaseFire or any other group know about the reasons for the high rural suicide rate?
Yeah, we know a good bit about high rural suicide rates. I mean, it's a few things. It's one, access to firearms. So firearms firearms make up about 5% of suicide attempts and 50% of suicide deaths. So the reason that's true, so there are a small percentage of attempts, but there are half of all gun suicides are with a firearm. The reason is because it's mostly fatal, unlike other attempts. So, you know, one is just access to firearms. Two is, you know, rural communities facing loss of jobs, economic loss, depression, you know, kind of all those pieces lead to kind of a perfect space of disconnection and crisis for many people. I think that's also part of it. And then I don't know if I've seen any research on it, but I would posit that, you know, insofar as it, you know, people's willingness to have conversations and talk about their experiences and what they're thinking really matters. And it may just be that those communities haven't quite learned how to do that yet, especially when you're talking about things like depression and crisis, where there's a lot of religious and other taboos on it. So those are probably the main reasons we see really high rural suicide, but firearms being present is a big one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. What can we learn from the success in Massachusetts? What can we learn in Pennsylvania from their success in becoming the safest state? I know it's a different political climate, but are there tips we can borrow?
No, it's a good question. We should definitely learn a lot. I mean, the biggest thing that they have is really I mean, I think there's a few things. So the biggest thing is they have a web of like gun safety laws that keep firearms from people who want to hurt themselves and others. That starts when you purchase a firearm and you have to get a permit and you have to get training for that permit. I can walk into a store today. I haven't shot a firearm in a year and a half. I went in with a friend. I shot a bunch of firearms to just see what it was like at a range. I haven't shot a gun in a year and a half. I could walk in up this, you know, to a place here in Philly and buy one today. The permit ensures you know what you're doing. It goes through the importance of safety. It has conversations around kind of why you're buying the gun, not to prevent you, but just to make sure that if you're at risk, we're getting you the help you need. And we know a lot of people that go in and buy a gun and buy their first gun in their life. Friends of mine's brother at 21 years old walked into a dealer in Lafayette Hill and purchased his first firearm, and 2 hours later it was gone from us. So, you know, I think that the permitting is probably the biggest step forward. The things like extreme risk protection orders, lost and stolen reporting, safe storage requirements are all part of that puzzle and are very common. There was a chart last week or last weekend of like gun safety laws and states looking at the death rate and how many, the more restrictive gun laws. And as you got more restrictive, you had less deaths perfectly. So, you know, I think we just know that's true. There are some other different things about Massachusetts that it's just worth noting. Comparatively, Philadelphia is a much poorer city. And we know that there's a link between economic issues and violence. And so programs that help address those and strengthen those community bonds and eventually have better economic transformational development is really critical. And we know that Pennsylvania is more rural than most of Massachusetts. I know there's Western Massachusetts, but like, come on, it's not like William, you know, up in like the north central part tier of Pennsylvania. And so I think those things really also matter a lot.
Okay, we all are tired of the thoughts and prayers response to violence, although prayers are a good thing. But what can we do about the lock that the NRA has on our elected representatives?
Yeah. And I will start by saying, I will say in PA, the NRA is a little less of our problem these days than like some of these newer groups like Gun Owners of America that are shockingly even more extreme than the NRA, which I know seems crazy. There's a really good podcast about this called No Compromise that won some awards. I think that I think the thing is that like we keep saying 70, 80, 90% of Pennsylvanians support gun safety laws, right? The polls are pretty clear, Republican pollsters, Democratic pollsters, everything, but we don't vote like it. And so we've got to figure out a way fundamentally get people to vote around this issue and recognize it. And I think part of that is, you know, sort of the question about people who've been impacted by gun violence or not. For many people, it doesn't feel immediate. It's not top of mind. It's important to them, something they agree with. And I think getting people to understand how we've designed a system to cost lives, not that it's like random happenstance that we have to intervene in, but we've actually designed a system to drive gun deaths functionally, is really an important piece of that puzzle. And then getting people to understand how folks like, Representative Williams are allowing that to continue to happen. And if we do that, I think we can start to break the lock. Being this is the League of Women Voters and there's this C3 thing and blah, blah, blah. I'll keep my electoral spiel for another day. But I think, constituents are really getting, every time you have a conversation, someone's like, oh yeah, I agree with that. Then do you vote according to that? I don't care who you vote for, but who you vote on this issue. If you're worried about crime in Philly, are you voting for legislators who supported lost and stolen reporting or opposed it, right? Really making that connection to these policy decisions on something that has been so intractable is really going to be important.
Good, thank you. So we have a question and a comment. One is, how have groups, or have any groups? I think the answer is yes, but how have groups framed gun safety as a public health issue? And then we have the comment that is a feature of Massachusetts. They have a very strong public health system.
They do. So there has been a movement, I would say, over the last 5 to 6 years in a variety of ways to think about gun violence as a public health issue and as a disease that spreads. And when you look at it in that way, it really points towards policy solutions and all that. And so there is definitely a movement around that. There's a lot of both in the academic space and the advocacy space talking about what that means and what are the prescriptions to intervene in diseases and stop that, transmission, especially when you're talking about community level violence, a little less so on mass shootings and suicide. But when you're talking about the violence we see in cities, a lot of it is retaliatory and also oriented towards beefs, less and less of it, not less of it, but a lot of the rise was in that space, not in like criminal activity spaces. And so how do you see that happening, playing out, and then prevent it? So a lot of the work we do to get money for community violence prevention programs is around that ideal that this is a public health issue. And if we have really strong community-based programs that help identify those at highest risk, connect them with workforce programs, provide trauma-informed care and counseling, give them tools to resolve conflicts in different ways, we've seen real large reductions in violence. It's probably the reason, frankly, shootings at violence in Philly is down 30% because we've changed no laws. So the only thing we've done is we put about $80 million into violence reduction programs. And I think many of those are working. So we've got to keep that funding going.
Okay, thank you. One of our live questions is, has to do with sources for knowing how to support gun safety. And before you say something, I'm going to comment to this person that as we're going, Kathy and Ann are putting links into the chat that are going to be available when this material goes onto our website. So in addition to comments that Adam might have about this, be aware to keep your eyes peeled for this to come available to you. So Adam, what are some of your favorite sources out there besides your own website for how to inform us about supporting gun safety?
Yeah, and I missed your comments, Nancy, unfortunately, because my internet froze. I mean, in terms of like securing your firearms, I do often turn to like American Academy of Pediatrics and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has really good resources. They also have really good resources on how to have these conversations with other folks. And I think those are really important tools. And then Brady has a campaign called End Family Fire that's really an educational campaign around safe storage. In terms of public policy and advocacy, I would say at the national level, there's, a few different groups. We work a lot with Brady and Giffords at the national level. I know there was a question about this ATF rule. And so, I kind of think of it as they look to us for what's driving forward state policy, and we look to them at what's driving forward federal policy. And so we're really coordinating around that. And Brady, especially, we're working really closely on trafficking issues and dealing with gun trafficking and some stuff around the supply side pieces. And obviously every town does really good work with their field teams here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. and other pieces. And then if you're looking more academically, if you're like an academic, since I know that was mentioned earlier, the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, which was a merged group of Johns Hopkins long-term research on this and another nonprofit, has been really at the forefront of research and understanding and implementation of gun violence prevention policies. They are most focused on extreme risk protection orders and permit to purchase policies, but have a wealth of well-researched information, as well as independent research information. Correction of my question, sources for who supports gun safety. Jennifer, if you mean legislators, is that what you mean?
I don't.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Sorry, trying to. So in terms of legislators, we put out a scorecard every time there's enough votes to put one out, and it's on our website. I'll drop it up there. But the scorecard walks through recent votes by legislators and what they did, and that's probably the best source. I tend to think how people vote is the best way to figure this out, and you can look at every legislator in the state. We didn't do a federal one yet, but you can look at every state legislator based on their current voting record, which I think is like the kind of the key piece of this conversation.
Thank you. What can be done about ghost guns?
Yeah. So ghost guns are, just for everyone's knowledge, are mostly put together guns that you buy on the internet, and for a long, long time did not need any background check or tracing on them. There was an ATF rule that passed about a year ago and is currently on hold while the court case proceeds, that said these are guns that if you have something that's 80% built, that's sold together, that's anyone can put together in an hour or less with some basic tools, it's a gun. Come on. And you've got to get a background check, and you've got to have it serialized, a serial number for tracing purposes. And that's really what we're asking for. I want to be clear about this. We're not saying you can't sell parts of guns, but what we're saying is that at some point you got to follow the same rules, because obviously if you're buying a gun part, you're not buying a hunk of metal to melt down and forge yourself in your home with your forge and your blacksmiths and all. You're buying something that was designed and intended to become a gun. And in that sense, then that must be your purpose. And so you got to run a background check, because, you should be able to get a background, you should be able to pass it. And so that's what we're asking for. And so we're hoping that that rule goes into effect. And then in the meantime, the state is looking at some different bills around that.
Okay, thank you. What can a general average person do to make sure that they are safe in public spaces when we have all these guns being carried around, like at the mall or at an entertainment venue?
Yeah. Well, those places can issue no gun rules. Some places have a no carry policy. So you could ask, I think, the local stores to put a policy in place that says we don't allow firearms inside. I think that'd be really good. I know there's been efforts to get like Wawa to do that and others. And so I think that's probably in the short term the best. And then, there's pushes to get the legislature to pass bills that say parks and recreation centers or concerts, no guns allowed. There's nothing to stop you from going to your local grocery store and saying, hey, after Buffalo, I'm thinking about this more. Would y'all consider putting a policy in place that just says we don't have guns in there? And because you can generally not leave your gun in your car for a lot of reasons, people then would probably stop carrying them.
Well, it's ironic, isn't it, that you're not allowed to carry a gun into the state capitol?
Yes, or the NRA convention for that matter, but
Yes, right. Oh no,
just saying.
They're dangerous, but not for other people, just for them. Okay. Do you have anything else to say about how we decide, generally speaking, who can and who cannot carry a gun?
I mean, look, just to talk about it a little bit. So if you look at what the main law, yellow flag law does, and there's a few reasons we don't think it works very well. But one of the biggest reasons is the indicators it uses. So to get yellow flagged in Maine, you have to have a diagnosed mental health condition that a psychologist has diagnosed you with and said that that's a risk. There are lots of people that don't have diagnosable mental health conditions and never will, who pose a risk to themselves and others. And so what extreme risk protection orders do is say, what are the criteria that we know based on years and years of evidence that make someone more likely to indicate that they're going to hurt themselves or others? For example, buying a gun is one of those indicators, not across the board, not on its own. That's not how the law works, but it's an indicator. If you are talking about, God forbid, shooting up a place and you haven't gone and bought a gun, you're a little bit less of a risk probably. But the moment you go out and buy one, you're a higher risk. So what we look at is indicators like that. Some of those are criminal things like felony records, violent felony records, prosecutions of domestic violence incidences, child abuse, etc. But others are threats you've made. So those are the sort of things. The only real legal ones are felon records and a few misdemeanors. And then domestic violence restraining orders. And it's what's known as a final protection from abuse order in Pennsylvania. And it's the final order is when you lose access to guns.
Okay, we just got a live question. Is it still the case in Pennsylvania that you can visibly carry a gun in most circumstances?
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania, you can openly carry, as it's known, everywhere with no permit except for the city of Philadelphia. About 40 years ago, I think now, 35 years ago, there was a state law passed that said to carry openly in Philadelphia, and only in Philadelphia, you have to have what's known as a concealed carry permit. So no one really openly carries in Philly. We don't really think there should be as much concealed carry as there is now, but yeah. So in general, like I could walk to a store today, buy a firearm, walk out of the store with it in a holster on my hip with no training and walk around town. And there's like nothing anyone could do. People don't do it a ton because it's awkward. I mean, like you get looks. So most gun owners aren't like that. I want to say this, like we think of gun owners as like the extremist NRA people that you hear about, that you read about, that are opposing these initiatives. That is probably 20% of all gun owners. Most gun owners are like my coworker, Carol, who has a gun to go hunting. Most of them are like my deputy director, Brandon, who carries a firearm sometimes for his personal safety. Most of them are, or Krista, who does the same. So most gun owners, are not those people. And so we have to be really clear when we're talking about gun owners, what we're talking about. And that's why you don't see most gun owners carrying a firearm around town in downtown media or something.
Yeah, I mean, that triggers for me, I think, my big question. I think about hunters all the time. I think about Canada, most people in Canada, it's very prevalent in the population in Canada for people to be hunters and have a firearm, but they have an extraordinarily low rate of firearm deaths. And I think a lot, I don't have any good answers about the cultural difference between Canada and the United States. We seem to be a pretty violent country.
Yeah, I don't think we're more violent than any other country, honestly. I just think we have access to deadlier tools.
Okay. I don't know.
I mean, I think if you looked at, it's going to depend a little bit if you looked at it, but if you controlled for a few characteristics like economics, right? Like if you controlled for that, I think you'd find the rates are pretty close to the same, except that we have access to deadly weapons.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. They might do it with knives and fists. I don't know. Do we have any more urgent questions? We have 3 minutes left. We can entertain 1 or 2 more live questions. I think we've covered most of the topics that came in advance, and I thank you for submitting those. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come up. So Adam, thank you so much for sharing this hour with us and your expertise. This was just great. And
Thank you all so much.
yeah, the resources you've shared and the information are going to be real helpful for us. Thanks a lot.
And if anyone, I mean, the League of Women Voters is a member of the coalition. If y'all want to get involved, obviously through the league, we also have a local organizer, Grant. She's doing great work in Delaware and Chester County. So happy to be here to help support the league as y'all continue to help us create a safer Pennsylvania. So just reach out anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take good care,
Bye.
everybody. Have a great weekend.